Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 10. Svanlaug and her Shieldwives. As the 99th year of the Common Reckoning drew toward its close, Dwarfbridge learned of the defeat and death of its lord, Orm, at the Battle of Apsley. Unfounded rumours circulated that the army of Godric was marching toward Dwarfbridge, intent on sacking and burning it. Panic was widespread, and many dwarves fled to the Geitsmark, including Orm's sister, Raghild. She was not the only member of the ruling family to take to her heels. Ingvild, the widow of Hunwulf, Orm's brother and predecessor as Lord of Dwarfbridge, sought safety with her father Boddi in the Dark Hills, taking her children with her. But Orm's widow, Svanlaug, remained in Dwarfbridge. She said that she had already lost her husband and did not now intend to lose her home. Better to die alone defending it than live the rest of her life as a vagrant, relying on the charity of others. And those who felt likewise rallied to her, and many who had been preparing to leave felt ashamed of their cowardice, and some of them resolved instead to stay and fight with her. Even so, the road from Dwarfbridge to Riverton was busy. Not only was there a constant flow of carts filled with dwarves and all their worldly goods heading for Bensby Bridge, but those halflings who still dwelt between Dwarfbridge and Overwater were leaving these lands, leaving them to the Skeldings, and heading over the Dwarfbridge. Many of these halflings were travelling to Riverton in order to join Murdo Hamfist on his journey to the east, and against the flow of all this traffic, Murdo Hamfist travelled from Riverton, where he had been making arrangements for the journey, and presented himself to Svanlaug. "Your husband wrote to his kin," he said, "to arrange free passage for the halflings over the dwarvish lands to the empty lands in the east. You should have received responses to those letters by now." Svanlaug looked at the halfling. "Things have changed," she said. "My husband is dead." Murdo shrugged. "They have not changed for me," he replied. "I saw Orm write and dispatch those letters. Are you telling me that they have not been answered?" Svanlaug sighed. "Yes," she said, "they have been answered. King Hammond and Queen Ranveig will give you free passage across the Geitsmark, but on behalf of King Botolph, Earl Boddi has refused you passage across his lands. He states that he and his kin have no love for halflings, and he does not want halflings to settle on his borders, where they may subsequently prove troublesome. And, in any case, he wants those empty lands for his own folk." Murdo scowled. "And so you dwarves break another promise," he said. "But I have thousands of halflings assembling at Riverton. No, not thousands, but tens of thousands. If Boddi will not give us free passage, well, we will fight our way through." "If you are so keen on fighting," observed Svanlaug, "then there is plenty of fighting to be done here, and land to be won, land that once belonged to your folk." "No," said Murdo, "we will fight for you dwarves no longer. And why should we fight for you when you will not fight for yourselves? As I journeyed here, I passed your people, a fleeing rabble, running down the road to Bensby Bridge. I will not waste more halfling lives in your losing cause." "But if the Skeldings defeat us, what then?" asked Svanlaug. "What when they cross the Dwarfbridge? What when Riverton and Forkings and Fairwood and all your other pretty halfling towns are burned and all your people are massacred? What then?" Murdo laughed. "That is not my problem," he said. "That is the problem of the wealthy halflings who own the land and the farms and everything else. They can do their own fighting to protect their own property. Those that I speak for have no farmland, no livelihood, nothing that the Skeldings can destroy. That is why we seek new lands, lands we can call ours, where we can build and own those things. If we have to fight, then we will fight for that, for ourselves." Svanlaug shrugged. "Then there is nothing more to say," she said. Murdo Hamfist returned to Riverton. He did not know it, but on his journey he was passed by a messenger heading to Geitspin, bearing a letter from Svanlaug to Queen Ranveig. This letter made a request and a suggestion. The request was that King Hammond and Queen Ranveig send fighting dwarves to defend Dwarfbridge. The suggestion concerned Murdo Hamfist. In her letter, Svanlaug alerted Ranveig to Murdo Hamfist's declaration that, if his path was blocked, he would make war upon the dwarves of the Dark Hills. Any such halfling attack would have to be launched from the Geitsmark, and whether or not Hammond and Ranveig endorsed the halflings' actions, this would strain relationships between Geitspin and the Hillhold. Svanlaug therefore suggested to Ranveig that she and Hammond redirect the halflings, sending them down the southern bank of the Silver Stream to the empty lands between that river and the Gaptooth Mountains. Svanlaug explained that settling the halflings here would have the following advantages. Firstly, it reduced the distance that the potentially belligerent halflings would need to travel through Hammond and Ranveig's lands. Secondly, the newly settled halflings would form a buffer between the Geitsmark and any future Skelding advance up the south bank of the Silver Stream. Thirdly, if the halflings disappeared over the Dark Hills, the dwarves of the Geitsmark would lose the opportunity to trade with them. That would be unfortunate, as such trade would be lucrative. Those who clear land and then farm it require many tools and other things. I do not know if King Hammond and Queen Ranveig appreciated having Svanlaug teach them to suck eggs. I do not believe that they ever thanked her for her advice, but they did pay her the compliment of following it. When Murdo Hamfist crossed Bensby Bridge, the long column of his followers strung out behind him, he found Queen Ranveig and 200 armoured spear dwarves awaiting his arrival. Ranveig greeted Murdo warmly. After all, was she not the granddaughter of Norby halfling friend? And was there not an eternal bond of friendship between her folk and the halflings? She understood that Earl Boddy had not been so friendly. That was no surprise. He was of the house of Hogney after all, and the battles of Drown Daisy Ford and Nygard had not been forgotten in the Hillhold. But if the Dark Hills and the lands beyond were closed to the halflings, there were lands nearer at hand that were not, flat, fertile lands that she was happy to gift to the halflings. And so it was that Murdo and his followers turned right and marched downstream and settled to the west of Unnascrag, on the broad plains between the Gaptooth Mountains and the Silver Stream. The question of how many halflings emigrated with Murdo Hamfist is a matter of scholarly debate. There is no doubt that the halfling population was growing rapidly in its traditional heartlands at the end of the 1st century of the Common Reckoning. Hamlets grew into villages, and villages grew into towns. For example, the halfling towns of Westmead, Yarrowlee, and Applevale are first mentioned in records from around this time. It therefore seems that the potential number of emigrants was relatively high. But notwithstanding this, some of the numbers quoted in the later histories stretch credulity. For example, one source speaks of the tread of 250,000 bare feet. The current consensus rejects these numbers, considering that maybe 50,000 to 100,000 halflings emigrated in total, and that, rather than all travelling in a single group, the emigrants probably travelled in many smaller groups, spread over a period of several years. Whatever the truth of the matter, the halflings flourished in their new land. They founded the market town of Hamfistham and elected Murdo as its first mayor. Over the following few years, they extended their settlements further down the valley of the Silver Stream, first founding the enigmatically named town of Muffins, followed by the more obviously named town of Elm Grove. Although Hammond and Ranveig followed Svanlaug's advice in relation to the halflings, they did not accede to her request to send military assistance. Notwithstanding this, about 100 dwarves from the Geitsmark, many of whom had fought with Orm at the Battle of Bleakbrook, did independently march to Svanlaug's aid. She was also able to persuade a similar number of halfling archers to fight with her, to defend the dwarf bridge and the halfling settlements beyond. However, the most famous of those who fought with Svanlaug were her shield maidens. Although they often owned property and managed business matters and drank as hard as their menfolk, it was most unusual for dwarvish women to fight in battle, not least because they were smaller, slenderer and weaker than dwarvish men. But, inspired by Svanlaug's example, it appears that many of the women of Dwarfbridge declared that they wished to actively defend their homes and offered to serve Svanlaug in the capacity of warriors. Not all those who put themselves forward were accepted, but those who were deemed capable were appropriately equipped, and throughout the winter they, along with Svanlaug herself, practiced their martial skills. Now, popular history refers to these dwarvish female fighters as shield maidens, but this is inaccurate. It seems that the women who fought alongside Svanlaug were mostly older, married women, fighting for their homes and their children, rather than younger, single women, most of whom fled or were sent away for their own safety. Indeed, several of the younger women who offered to fight were rejected by Svanlaug, who is reported to have said that she would not send a girl to do a woman's work. Thus, it seems that very few of these fighting women were actually maidens, and that Shieldwives would be a better description. In the spring of the 100th year of the Common Reckoning, Godric and his army marched on Dwarfbridge, and a great battle was fought. The dwarves fought bravely, and Svanlaug's Shieldwives covered themselves in glory. But Godric triumphed, and Dwarfbridge was burned to the ground. Many dwarves and dwarf wives died that day, but not completely in vain. The dwarves destroyed the dwarf bridge, so that Godric was unable to cross it and ravage the halfling lands beyond, and Svanlaug and a number of her people escaped from the battlefield with their lives. Distraught and homeless they were, but also independent-minded, resolute, and contemptuous of weakness. They had no desire for pity or charity. Thus, rather than seeking refuge with their kin in the Geitsmark, they fled up the river Tumblewater into the fastnesses of the Twilight Mountains. Here they found security in an isolated valley surrounded by jagged mountain peaks, where they founded the settlement that they called Svanheim, and for many years their whereabouts was not known. But dwarves are well suited to life in the hills, and the settlement thrived. Godric ordered that all traces of Dwarfbridge should be destroyed and the site left desolate. He reissued the law that any halfling entering Skelding lands thereby forfeited their life, and expanded it to make the same provision in relation to dwarves. But the law was unnecessary. No halflings or dwarves afterwards tried to enter the Skelding lands, at least not those Skelding lands to the north of the silver stream.